Welcome everyone to the second share. So last week, we started exploring the ways in which Sukkot can act as a intensification of universal values, and we gave the example just to remind ourselves of Pesach, where even though there is a daily mitzvah. There's a daily commandment and value to reflect on and remember the Exodus from Egypt, to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. Once a year, we really delve into it. We spend time telling the story to ourselves, to our family. We act it out. We have the props of matzah and maror and the like, and we understand that those are related. The daily commemoration of Egypt is connected to the intense experience that we have on Pesach, that it provides the background, by really making sure that we are engrossed in that experience once a year, so we can tap into that throughout the rest of the year. So there is a relationship between those two aspects. And we said that at some level, the same thing happens on Sukkot. And yet last week, we focused on the value of aesthetic beauty, especially in mitzvot, of recognizing the power of putting in that effort in mitzvot, of what it expresses about our own commitment. We talked a little bit about the uniqueness of aesthetics and why specifically that is what we want to accentuate on Sukkot. And today I want to do a similar type of analysis, but not on the mitzvah of the Arba Minim, not on the lulav and the etrog and the hadasim and the ravot, but on the other mitzvah, the one for which the holiday gets its name, and that is the Sukkah. And specifically, the I would say anomalous, but we'll see. That's really the question of how anomalous it is. Exemption that we have by the mitzvah of Sukkot, that even somebody who is mildly inconvenienced or discomforted by the performance of the mitzvah is exempted from eating, sleeping, living in the Sukkah. And what we want to see is, what exactly is that law? What does it tell us about Sukkah and Sukkot? And is it unique to Sukkot, or is this really something that is more expansive? Now, at first glance, it's very hard to say that it's more expansive because many mitzvot entail a certain amount of difficulty and lack of from the very basics, right? Waking up early in the morning to go to shul, if you want to sleep late, can be inconvenient. And we don't just say, well, no one who's not a morning person ever has to go to shul. Right? We don't say things like that. Everything can have a certain amount of discomfort. So what we need to do is analyze what exactly this means. So I'll pull up the sources here. And we begin here in the Gemara in Sukkah Daf Chafei. And the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda. So Rabbi bar Zavda says, in the name of Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, Avel Chayev b'Sukkah. Someone who's in mourning is nevertheless obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah. So the Gemara says, well, Pshita, that's obvious. Now, in general, there is an earlier state in mourning, namely the state of aninut, the state immediately after death before burial, where the person who is, I would say, in mourning, but more precisely, is not yet in mourning, right? He or she hasn't started the process of mourning, because the process of mourning only begins once the body has been buried. This pre-mourning state, either because, as you have two formulations, either because one's own sole obligation at that moment is to tend to the body, and therefore one is exempted from other mitzvot, or perhaps at a certain level, the intense experience or contact with death at that moment is incongruent with the idea of mitzvot. But once one starts avelut, so while there are certain limitations in terms of how you dress and how you sit and how your house is arranged, Fundamentally, one remains obligated in all the commandments. So the Gemara says, well, Avel, so therefore one who is in mourning, chayav b'sukkah, is obligated in dwelling in the sukkah. So Gemara says, well, pshita, isn't that obvious? Someone, as we just said, someone who's in mourning remains obligated in mitzvot. So Mao detema hoel v'amar Rabbi Abba barzav da amarav. So Gemara says you might have thought that it's not the case because there's a unique rule, mitztaer patur min sukkah, that someone who is in distress, someone who is suffering from the performance of the mitzvah of sukkah, is exempt. So you might have said, well, hi, nami mitztaeru. So if somebody is a mourner, they are distressed, they're emotionally distraught, and therefore you might say that they don't have to dwell in the sukkah. Kamash malan. So it comes to teach us, hani milei tzara dimimela. Aval hacha iu dekom etztar nafshe ibayle liyituve daate. Now the Gemara says something very surprising here, and he says, listen, there's two types of suffering. There are cases where the suffering happens because of the sukkah itself, or the nature of dwelling in the sukkah. It is too hot. So that's the nature of living in a sukkah. Sometimes you are outside and it is too hot. In Israel, that happens not infrequently, that Sukkot is very, very hot. And therefore, when you are in the sukkah, you may be sweating, you may be missing your air conditioning, or as more likely in North America, it is too cold. All of that is intrinsic to living outside for a week. And if the heat, the cold, the smells, the bugs get too unbearable, so then, in fact, you are exempt from being in the sukkah. But by the mourner, so it's true that someone who's in mourning may be emotionally distressed, but that is not necessarily increased or decreased by the presence in the sukkah, right? You can imagine someone who, when they're in mourning, they need to be in the fresh air. They need a change of scenery. They go onto their porch. They go into their backyard. Other people might want to be in their house, but the point is that there's nothing about being in the sukkah that is. I'm in the middle of a share. There's nothing about being in the sukkah that is particularly uncomfortable for a mourner. Right, no more than being in the house. Obviously, they're in distress because they just lost a relative, but it's not the sukkah which is causing that discomfort, and therefore, they are obligated in the sukkah. So here, the Gemara introduces this principle that mitztaer patur min sukkah, that if someone is uncomfortable in the sukkah, they're exempt. But the Gemara clarifies that has to be a case where the discomfort emerges for something intrinsic to the sukkah. Right? If someone happens to be that when they're in mourning, they want to be inside for whatever reason and not outside. Okay, well, that's not intrinsic to the sukkah, so that's not called mitztaer. But there is this exemption that if the sukkah itself causes lack of comfort, so then the person can leave. Similarly, in source 2, the Gemara says, Rava sharale l're'acha bar ada l'migna barmi mitalelta mishum sircha de gargishta. Rava allowed Rabbi Acha. I see this is the wrong English that got copied here. He allowed someone to live outside of the sukkah because of the smell that came from the sukkah. Why does a bad smell exempt one from living in the sukkah? So again, the Gemara says, Rava l'taimei, the Amarava mitztaer patru min sukkah, that being uncomfortable makes one exempt from the sukkah. The Gemara says, Va'anantan cholim misham shem turim min sukkah chola in mitztaer lo. But doesn't the Gemara say that a sick person and the people who help the sick are exempt from the sukkah? Now that implies that only someone who rises to the level of illness, but not someone who's merely uncomfortable. So our answer is no. Amri chole hu misham shav pturin. Someone who is sick is exempt from the sukkah, and so are the aides, so are the people who helped him or her. But mitztaer, but someone who is merely uncomfortable, hu patur. So it's true that the person who's uncomfortable is exempt from the sukkah. Misham shav lo, but the aides don't. Right. So if someone is bedridden and people are helping the sick person. So then both the sick person and the aides are exempt. But if someone has a headache, right, has a migraine, they don't need help, right? They just need dark. And the sukkah is outside and it's bright and they have a sensitivity to light. So that person isn't sick, not in the halachic sense anyways. They just need to be inside in a dark room. So they are exempt, but other people are not exempt on their behalf. So we have this principle that one who is uncomfortable in the sukkah is exempt from performing the mitzvah, and they can go and they can eat and they can sleep and they can dwell inside. And if you look in 3, the Rambam codifies this. Cholin umisham shehen pturin min sukkah. The sick and those who aid them are exempt from the sukkah. Now, we're not talking about someone whose life is in danger, because then you would be exempt from any mitzvah in the Torah, barring the big 3. Even if someone has a headache or has a sore eye, mitzta'er patur min sukkah, one who is in pain is exempt from the sukkah. Who v'lo misham shav, him and not those who help him. Ve'ezu mitzta'er, what does it mean to be uncomfortable and therefore be exempt? It could be anything. Someone can't sleep in the sukkah because it's windy, or because there's too many flies, or because there's other types of bugs, or because of a smell. So this is an established fact. No one disagrees with this, that one who is uncomfortable in the sukkah because of something intrinsic to the sukkah, the heat, the cold, the flies, the wind, any of those things exempt one from the sukkah. Now, as we did last week, we have to ask, okay, well, why? Right? Is this principle unique? Is there something about the mitzvah of sukkah that makes it unique, such that it is particularly sensitive to the comfort of the people who are living in the sukkah? Or is this reflective of a more general approach to mitzvot, where comfort, for whatever reason, is central to the performance of mitzvot? And if one reaches a certain level of discomfort, so then one is exempt. Now, as I mentioned, at first glance, it seems that the answer is obvious, that the notion that one who's uncomfortable is exempt from living in the sukkah has to be local to the sukkah, because people are uncomfortable with all types of things, right? People are uncomfortable waking up early in the morning, go to shul. People, sometimes it's uncomfortable to prepare food for Shabbat or Chagim, especially when you have a 2-day Yom Tov, a 3-day Yom Tov, right? It can be uncomfortable, but we still do it. It can be uncomfortable to, right, depending on how we stretch uncomfortable, right? It can be uncomfortable to have to spend extra money on kosher food, on Jewish education. It can be uncomfortable to, right, anything. It can be uncomfortable. And yet we don't say that people are exempt from any mitzvah that gives them the slightest bit of discomfort. And in fact, for this reason, basically, the majority of commentaries say that the reason that on Sukkot one is exempt when he's uncomfortable is because Sukkah is different. Namely, and Rabbi Manoach captures this in 4, and he says very simply, V'yesh latei tam. Let me explain. V'lomar, the high dazlina b'mitzvat sukkah likula liftor mitztayer yoter mishar mitzvot. The reason that by sukkah we exempt someone who's merely uncomfortable from of sukkah, mishum dechtiv teshvu v'darshinan teshvu kein taduru. Because the Torah says, you shall live in the Sukkot for 7 days. And Chazal derive from the word teshvu, you shall live, you shall reside, that the very definition of the mitzvah of Sukkah is that the Sukkah becomes your home. And whatever standards you would apply in your home, you apply in the Sukkah. So if you're going on a hike and it's hot, you probably, unless it's brutally hot, will probably continue on the hike because, well, you're going on a hike. But if you're in your house, and it's 100 degrees outside and the air conditioning breaks, right? That's when you leave. That's when you go to a friend. That's when you go to the mall. That's when you go to a library. You go somewhere where it's air conditioned until you can fix your air conditioning. And if that's the standard in your house, then it's the standard in the sukkah, because the sukkah becomes your home for a week. And therefore he says, V'darshina teshvu kein tediru. We derive that you live in the sukkah the way you live in your home. Shoto ragil beveito, the way that you live in your home. Le'achol u'mechayev b'sukkah. So if you eat in your home, you eat in the sukkah. V'chol l'shein v'sakana lo machchin le'achol imazik lo machal o mitztairu v'rotzeh lachol tachat avir. So if someone is sick and he can't eat here, he needs fresh air, fresher air than the sukkah. Whatever. Inachanami lo mitzrachin le'achol b'sukkah. Aval mitztar b'shar mitzvot lo patrin in lay. But by other mitzvot, where their definition is not live the way you live normal life. So obviously, we do expect you to expend effort, even if that will make you uncomfortable. And what Rabbi Menach is hinting at is, as we see in number 5, exactly right what he says in short. We see in the Mishnah and the Gemara in long form, right, which is that the definition of the mitzvah of Sukkah is that you have to live in the sukkah exactly as in your house, right? That is the nature of the mitzvah. So the Mishnah tells us in 5, Kol shivate amim adam oses sukkato keva ubeito arai. For 7 days, the sukkah becomes your primary residence, and your home becomes your secondary residence, your temporary residence. Yardug shamim ematay mutar lifnot. Now, when are you allowed to leave? If it starts raining, because as we said, again, if you're uncomfortable, and raining might even be more than that, when can you leave? How much rain? When it starts making your soup spoil, right? So we all know that sometimes in your house, the roof leaks a little bit, a drop here, a drop there. You might put a bucket down, but you don't necessarily leave the house. Once there starts to be a significant flow of water, then you leave. So what is this like? Parenthetically, the Mishnah says, well, what is it like if you're in the sukkah and it starts raining? Well, it's like a servant that offers a drink to his master. He's trying to do something nice, and then the master throws it back in his face. So too, if we go to the sukkah and it rains, it's as if we're trying to do something for God, and God throws it back in our face. And now the Gemara clarifies, Tana Rabbanan, Kol shivata yamim adam oses sukkato keva ubeito arai. For 7 days, you make your sukkah your primary residence and your house secondary. What does that mean? Keitzad hayelo kelim naim malam l'sukkah. So I know many of us don't do this, and we bring disposable plates and silverware to the sukkah. But the halacha actually is that if you have your china, you bring it to the sukkah. Matzot, no, malam l'sukkah. You have nice furniture and bedding, you bring it to the sukkah, right? And this, again, in Israel, the weather is a bit nicer and a lot more predictable. You do see a lot of people who do this. They actually move out their couches to the sukkah so they can sit there. Ochel v'shotel mitayel b'sukkah. You eat, you drink, and you just hang out in the sukkah. And how do you know? How do you know that basically anything you do in your house, you do in the sukkah? Titana Rabbana, because we learn in the Braita, Teishvu, the verse says, you shall dwell. Ke'ein taduru, the way you live. Mikan amru kol shivat amim osa adam sukkato keva ubeito arai. And from here you see that you make your sukkah for 7 days your primary house, and your home is secondary. Ketzad. Again, hayalokelim naim malam l'sukkah matzot naot malam l'sukkah ochel v'shotem matayel b'sukkah mishanim l'sukkah. Everything we saw, and you, including, and now it adds learning Torah. So the simple understanding, as Rabbeinu Manoach says, is that the reason that uniquely by sukkah, even mere discomfort exempts you from living in the sukkah is because, well, sukkah, the mitzvah is defined as you shall live in the sukkah way you do in your house. And therefore it's unique. No other mitzvah is defined as, well, live your normal life, just do it in the sukkah. But since this one is, so we have a much lower bar for what counts as a legitimate reason to leave. It's whatever you would do in your normal, mundane, regular life in your home. However, despite the very simple logic of that line of thinking, there is a surprising number of positions that say that no, maybe the fact that mitztayer exists in sukkah is actually indicative of a much wider exemption. And in fact, at some level, discomfort is a reason to exempt you from all mitzvot, or at least many mitzvot. So I gave you a few examples here. The Radbaz, Rav David ben Zimra, was an Egyptian scholar about 500 and plus years ago. And he says, So he said there were some people who had the custom to take a haircut on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, which, as we know, is part of Sfirat Omer, is part of the Omer, where there are certain minhagei of Elul, including not cutting your hair. And he says, Tshuva ana vidna uvda b'nafshay v'nistaber kol chodesh Nisan Rosh Chodesh Iyar v'chein agarova olam. I do that myself. I cut my hair in Nisan and on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and that is the custom. V'atam kevan shemasurin behesped v'tanit ein availut zeh shehu talui b'minhag noeg. So he says, look, the prohibition here is one of mourning, and cutting your hair is therefore just part of this custom. The prohibition to cut your hair doesn't really exist. It's not a prohibition. It's really a custom. Now, that's important too. But to override a minhag, right? So he said apparently there was a minhag to get a haircut on Rosh Chodesh. So you have the minhag not to get a haircut during Sfira, and you have a minhag to get one on Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so they knock each other out. That's the first half. But then he says, so the second thing is, look, people who get regular haircuts, letting their hair grow for even a month is really uncomfortable. And therefore, this custom isn't stronger than Sukkah, the Kaimalan Mitzar Patu. And there we say that someone who's merely uncomfortable is exempt. So here he already tells you that Sukkah acts as a model for the rest of Torah. Now, we have to admit, this is a very circumscribed case because he's asking that something he acknowledges is a custom, namely the custom not to cut your hair during Sfirat Omer. It's a weak custom, which is countered by a second custom, namely to get your hair cut on Rosh Chodesh. Plus, he throws in and you're uncomfortable. So he does expand the notion that discomfort can exempt you from things, but it's really only from a custom, which is itself a weak custom and has countervailing forces. So that doesn't prove much. But if you continue to the next piece, in 7, the Rabbi then says, well, I think it's actually more than that. Sha'alta mimeni odiacha da'ati amashamru chazal chayavadam lashlim parshiyotav imatzibur imu suma ochole beinav v'nachol likrot. So what if there's an obligation weekly to recite the parsha twice with the Targum, with one of the translations, either Onkelos, Rashi. But what if someone is blind or someone is hard of sight, and therefore it's not impossible. You could hire somebody to read the parsha to you and say it along with them or listen to them. Do I have to do that? That's not the most comfortable thing, right? It's one thing to say that every week you have to sit in your house and open up a chumash and familiarize yourself with the parsha. Okay, we like doing that. It's important. You should know the word of God. But to have to go every week and maybe several times a week, because a lot of people, when they do the parsha, they split it up and they do a little bit every day. Now, to learn for 10 minutes a day is not a big deal. To every day of the week, to have to go 10 minutes to somebody else's house to have them read the parsha to you, that's already not the best thing. So, im patur michiyuv zet, is he exempt from the rabbinic obligation to learn the parsha? And he says, well, yes. If someone is sick, he's exempt. Now, you could say because he's sick, but that's not where he goes. He says, he says, look, it's no worse than Sukkah. By Sukkah, if you're uncomfortable, you're exempt. So if it's uncomfortable for you to read the parsha because your eyes hurt, so then you're exempt. Now we've gone farther because now he says the notion of discomfort isn't just by Sukkah. So first he said it gets you out of custom, and now he says it gets you out of proper rabbinic law. The Geonim go even farther, and this is noted by Rav Chanan Wasserman in number 8. And Rav Chanan Wasserman says in 8, but Shuvara Geonim lik Tav Reish Chav Daled Siman Nun Aleph. They have a very surprising thing, right? I sort of joked before that we can't say that mere discomfort gets you out of a mitzvah, because then anyone who's not a morning person would never have to go to shul, would never have to daven, because it's hard to get up in the morning. I like sleeping until 10. Now, at first glance, you'd say, well, that's crazy. That's a reductio ad absurdum. Like, it can't be that getting up in the morning is hard, so you don't have to daven. And yet, the Gonim actually entertain such a possibility. Not exactly that case, but we'll see. He says, if someone is sick and can't daven, he says, no, not only is he exempt from the sukkah, but the aides are exempt from the sukkah, exactly as you have he's exempt, him and his aides are exempt from davening, from tefillah, just like they are by sukkah. Even if he's not in danger. Now, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman says, I don't understand. Right? How could you say that? How can you say that, well, by sukkah, someone who's sick doesn't have to be there, and the aides don't have to be there? That's true. But he says, that's because sukkah is unique. We already said that. So how can you tell me that, well, whatever is true of sukkah is true of davening? That just can't be. And yet, the Gonim entertained that, in fact, that was true. And now to see the most surprising source, in number 9, is a very controversial piece in the Shut B'Samim Rosh. So the Shut B'Samim Rosh was published in the 19th century by Rav Shaul Berlin, but it was attributed to the 13th century halachic decisive, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who was extremely important, becoming one of the 3 main sources for the halachic positions recorded in Shulchan Aruch. And now much has been written about the legitimacy, the validity of this book. Many believe, in fact, most believe that it's a forgery, that it was written by Rav Shaul Berlin, and he wasn't discovering it and publishing it, but rather he was writing it, and it was pseudepigraphy. It was attributed falsely to the Rosh to give it authority. One of the tshuvot that led people to believe that is the one we're about to read, because it creates an entire theology around this idea of mitzdayer, of the notion that mitzvot should be comfortable, and therefore discomfort is an automatic exemption from mitzvot. And again, the radical notion of what he's about to say was part of why people looked at it and said, this just can't be right. So he says as follows, you said that your wife, she can't handle the bitterness of maror. And you don't have the less extreme ones in your house, in your city, right? You just can't access the better marors, right? Because certain marors are right, like lettuce, most people can handle, but they only had sharp ones. So does someone who can't handle the sharpness of maror have to have maror? And he says, tshuva, lo mi by maror de lo ivrir helcha takidivrei mi. Inashim rishon chova reshut v'nim tzalmadem reshut vaday lo machayvinu and lemevet zecham megad shut shaleh. He said, listen, when it comes to your wife, who you're asking about, this is easier because it could be that there is a little bit of unclarity on the level of obligation that women have in maror, and therefore that gives us room. But he says, I don't even need that. Elafilu matzah. He said, even matzah, where there's no question that women are equally obligated, and it's biblical nowadays. The mandar matzah is said to oraita patur. Even the biblical mitzvah of matzah that everyone's obligated in nowadays. Still, if it makes you uncomfortable, now this tends to apply to a lot of people. A lot of people are not comfortable eating matzah. It gives them, it affects their stomach. They don't like how it tastes. Nevertheless, he says, uncomfortable, you're fine. Da'amrinan b'sukkah, because we say by sukkah, cholim u'misham shehen p'turin min ha'sukkah. Because we say that by sukkah, anyone who's sick and anyone who helps them is exempt from a sukkah. Lo chola sheish bo sekana. Not only someone who's sick and is in danger, ela afilu ein bo sekana. Even someone not in danger. And now he comes in for the kill. V'lav dafka sukkah. This is not only the mitzvah of sukkah. Shafilu mitzdayer ba'alma patur deteshu kenda duruktiv. Don't tell me only sukkah where we have that unique rule that you live in the sukkah as you live in your house. He says, no, learn from this a general principle that the Torah, its essence is that it's given for life. And it's just not pleasant. The Torah is called Deracher Darchei Noam. It's a Torah of pleasantness. So if it's not pleasant, don't do it. Dahainami mitzvah gedola, and making sure that you are comfortable is itself a great mitzvah, right? Don't even say it's an exemption. It's a mitzvah. Mikol lavrod gufo mikol choli, to make yourself healthy from any disease. Va'osek b'mitzvahu, by making sure that you are healthy, you are involved in a mitzvah. Upatur mishar mitzvah, and that makes you exempt from other mitzvot, i.e., matzah. You only need danger when you want to violate a prohibition. But to exempt yourself from a positive mitzvah, even a mere discomfort, exempts you from everything, because the Torah is one of life. And then later on, he says the same. He notes that the Yerushalmi, I'll just skim over here, that the Yerushalmi cites a case that Rabbi Yochanan used to have sensitivity to alcohol. So when he would have the 4 cups of wine on Pesach, he would have a 7-week headache that would go from Pesach to Shavuot, which seems to undermine his thesis, because a 7-week headache sounds extremely uncomfortable. And yet here was Rabbi Yochanan drinking wine nevertheless on Pesach. He says, well, yeah, whatever. Dafka arba kasot dechaviv alei. Whatever. That's because he liked it. He liked the mitzvah. And he says, midar chasidut hu David. It was pious of him. He didn't have to. I mean, he wanted to. But he definitely didn't have to. Now, when you read the Besamim Rosh, you understand why people thought it was a forgery. But you realize, because the theology that he's putting forth is so radical, right? So again, we had the Rabbeinu Manoach who said, listen, the reason that I'm Sukkot, if I'm uncomfortable in the Sukkah, I'm exempt, is because Sukkah is unique. Sukkah is defined as being my new home for these 7 days. So whatever I would do at home, I do in the Sukkah. And that's just Sukkot. But then we started to chip away at that. And we had the Rabbi who said, well, maybe certain customs, like not cutting your hair during Sfirat HaOmer. So that it's a minhag. Sukkah teaches us that discomfort can override a minhag. Then he says maybe it can even override a rabbinic law, like the obligation to read the parsha twice every week. And then we saw the Gaonim said, well, maybe even in a certain sense, prayer can be, we can use the rules of Sukkah to tell us when you're exempt from prayer. But then the Besamim Rosh comes and says, no, I'm introducing here a whole theology for you, which is that Torah is about comfort. Torah is about pleasantness. And if you're not pleasant, then don't do it. Then don't do it. You don't have to do it. Now, that, as we said, is a very clear example of seeing Sukkah not just as a unique halacha, but as a paradigm for all mitzvot. But, as I said, that seems to go way too far, because we all understand, right? I mean, this is like, it's cliche at this point, right? But anything that's worth doing, right, it's worth putting in effort, right? Not everything we think is meaningful and valuable in life do we say, well, you don't have to do it if it's uncomfortable. I mean, there are plenty of things about raising children that are uncomfortable. Most people don't love changing diapers, right? But if we said, well, we don't like changing diapers, so that's enough of a reason to never have children, most people would say that's, look, there are uncomfortable things that come with things that are important. So how can you just say that, well, it's uncomfortable to, a mitzvah is uncomfortable, so don't do it. Mitzvot are important, right? Mitzvot are important. And if they're important, so then you should be willing to endure a certain amount of discomfort. Obviously, there'll be a limit. If someone's going to be in danger, fine. So here I want to introduce a third view, right? Just like we did last week, we noted that you could have, a unique value, right? One that defines only this mitzvah, which here is what Rabbeinu Manawach does, where he says Sukkah is special. You could say that no, what looks like a unique special rule is in fact universal, which in its most extreme form is what the Besamim Rosh does here, and comes up with a theology that sounds nice at first glance, but basically undermines the entire notion that mitzvot are important and therefore deserve effort, even if that effort isn't the most comfortable thing in the world. I mean, there's going to be a limit, but still, mere discomfort, it seems crazy to say that gets you out of a mitzvah, or all mitzvot. So here, just like we did with Etrog last week, and just like we said about Pesach, I want to present a third possibility, which is, just like we said by Pesach, that there is the intense version of commemorating the Exodus, and that is Pesach. And then there's the secondary and daily less intense version that draws inspiration from that, which is, in Shema, we say the third paragraph that talks about Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt. And we saw that by Lulav and Etrog, there's, in general, a value of performing mitzvot beautifully, and we intensify that on Sukkot, and that inspires our performance of mitzvot throughout the rest of the year. Here, I would suggest that perhaps the truth is similar by Sukkah. And this I get from a short passage here in the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua, Rabbi Yitzchak of Vienna, living in 13th century Germany. And he says, "V'nir'eh be'enai." It seems to me, "Dehu hadin imag shamim yordim alav umitzta'er." Oh, so he's dealing with a case of someone is on a boat when Shabbat starts, and then the boat docks. So normally you're not allowed to leave the boat unless it was in the Tchum. But what happens if he's on the boat and it starts raining, or it is, shezarchalav chama v'sorafta, or the sun is burning him, right? It's a particularly hot day. Kigon b'tkufat Tammuz, like the middle of the summer, shemutar lo latzeit min hasfina letoch ha'ir. So I think that in that case, you're allowed to leave the boat on Shabbat. The kal vachomer misukkah. And he derives this from an argument from Sukkah. Shechayev lechol ba afal pichein tanan so perek hayashen yardu kshamim me'amatam mutar lefnom sheracha mikveh. By Sukkah, you're obligated to eat in the Sukkah, but if your food starts to get wet, you can leave. So at first glance, he sounds very much like the Radbaz, like the Gonim, like the Besamim Rosh, and he says, listen, in Sukkah, discomfort gets you out of a mitzvah. Here, it gets you out. I mean, even it's actually a prohibition, which is quite extreme to say that discomfort gets you out of prohibition, even if it's a low-level prohibition. So at first glance, it sounds like he thinks it's a universal rule. But then he says, well, va'od matzinu, and furthermore, shekavod habriot doche kilayim derabanan. We further have evidence that human dignity exempts you from rabbinic kilayim. So namely, the Yerushalmi in Kilayim says that if someone was walking in a public space and discovers that their clothing are made up of wool and linen, so now it's forbidden to wear the clothes. Train Amoraim, there's two Amoraim who weigh in. Chadam Asur, one says you have to take off your clothes in public. You can't keep wearing it. Chadam Mutar, one says you can keep wearing them until you get to a private place. Manda Oser Dvar Torah, Manda Matir, Kedam Reb Zira, Gadol Kavod Abriot, Shedochad Mitzvah, Below Taseh. And he says what it hangs on is this question of whether human dignity can override a mitzvah. Now, the idea that he's invoking here is found in the next source, which for some reason renumbered itself to 1, and then 12 picked up. I'm not sure why. The Gemara in Brachot says, Tashma, Gadol Kavod Abriot Shedochet Lo Taseh Shebo Torah. Human dignity is great, such that it overrides mitzvot from the Torah, biblical mitzvot. Gemara says, V'amai? How could that be? how could it be that human dignity overrides mitzvah? Don't we say that there is neither wisdom nor understanding, no counsel against God, meaning when God says to do something, you do it. So Tirgama Rav Bar Shva, Kamei Rav Kahana, beloved Tasur, he says, you're right. It can't get you out of a biblical law, but it can get you out of rabbinic law. So Achicho, they laughed at him. And they said, Lav V'lo Tasur D'oraitahi. The obligation to listen to the rabbis is itself biblical. So Amar Rav Kahana, Gava Rabba Milta Lo Tachicho Alei. Listen, don't laugh at him. Kol Mile der Abanan Asmechinu Alav Lo Tasur, Mishum Kvodera Sharabanan. All rabbinic law is based on the obligation to listen to the rabbis, but nevertheless, the rabbis are still the ones who commanded it, and they waive their obligations in the cases when it's human dignity, right? So classic cases that come up, right? Someone's in the restroom, and they realize on Shabbat that there's no pre-cut toilet paper, no tissues there, right? So then, right, it is, according to most poskim, permitted to tear the toilet paper, not on the lines, because then that would be biblical, right? But to do it not on the lines, maybe with a shinui, maybe in an abnormal way, tear it with your elbows or something. But because human dignity is at stake and there's rabbinic law, and you can override the rabbinic law. Now, by the time the Gemara is done with this principle, it's somewhat limited, right? It started off and said, human dignity is so great that it overrides the Torah law. Then the Gemara says it can't be. So it limited to rabbinic law. But Rav Lichtenstein, in an article he wrote many years ago, but was only published relatively recently, and then republished in the new book, Halachic Values, that they published from Maggid Press. He says, listen, I'll say this a little bit outside. He says a few points. He said, first of all, it may be true that in the end of the day, we only allow you to override rabbinic law, but you can't escape the importance of rhetoric. The Gemara says, Gadol kavod abriot shedoche lo taseh Shabbat Torah, that human dignity is great, so great, in fact, it has the power to override Torah law. What that tells you is that this is a Torah value, that human dignity is a Torah value. Now, how that expresses itself, so we have to figure out. And some people may overuse it, some people may underuse it. And Rav Lichtenstein here notes that many people in the 20th and 21st century may have overused it and use it to explain away many, many mitzvot, and that's not right. But he says, on the other hand, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore the fact that the value of human dignity permeates the halachic system, and that the values of human dignity should affect the way we think about halacha. As dangerous as it might be, but you have to. Why? So if you look at the bolded part, he says, look, quite apart from possible specific errors, there exists a potential graver danger. The axiological centrality of kavod habriyot or shalom as the moral and religious basis of large tracts of halacha may be seriously undermined. The dispensation provided them is not a mere technicality, nor is their application an exercise in legal mechanics. It is grounded in, and hence serves to sharpen and to heighten the awareness of their position as fundamental Torah values. The point is clearly emphasized in the basic relevant texts. The Gemara does not merely state, as it does in comparable cases elsewhere, that kavod habriyot overrides the usual norms in certain situations. It states rather, great is human dignity, so that it overrides a negative precept of the Torah. Right? Rav Lichtenstein says, listen, we can argue of exactly how you use this principle, right? When we invoke it, when we don't invoke it, when you're overusing it, when you seem to be playing with halacha too much. But the Gemara very clearly tells you, Gadol kavod habriyot, human dignity is a great value, at least at some fundamental level. It even has the power to override Torah values. Now, again, it's not always. There are limits to this, but it is a Torah value. This is central, and therefore you shouldn't overuse it, but you can't ignore it because it should permeate the way we think about Torah. Now, with that in mind, I go back now to the Or Zarua. And what I would suggest is as follows. On the one hand, we have a dilemma. On the one hand, it is clear that mitzvot have to be performed, even with a certain level of discomfort. Because as I said, anything that's valuable in life is worth doing, even if it's not always fun and games. Right? Again, raising children is meaningful, even if changing diapers or not, even if, whatever the case may be, it's not fun dealing with stitches. It is not feel dealing with, fights and kids who don't listen and cleaning up rooms and whatever, right? We like having people, simple things. We like having people over Shabbos meals. We find it meaningful to socialize, even though we understand that every time we socialize, that means either cooking or ordering food or cleaning the dishes, right? But the effort we put in is part of, right, work, right? We have to commute. People don't like commuting, but it's important to work. If we have a meaningful job, it's important to go to our job. Even if we don't have a meaningful job, it's important to be able to support ourselves and our families, right? Anything. Now, we try to minimize the discomfort, but things have discomfort. Things are hard. So you can't just say that discomfort, difficulty is enough to throw out all mitzvot. I mean, that's crazy. Mitzvot are valuable, and we put effort into everything, and we do things that are uncomfortable for things that are meaningful. But the other extreme, and here's why I bring the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua tells you, he reminds you that there is a universal value that, as Rav Lichtenstein notes, is central. It's hard to define. It isn't magic. It can't get rid of mitzvah, but it exists. And that is that part of the Torah, not extraneous to the Torah, but part of the Torah, is the idea that human dignity, the ability of human beings to live normal lives in a respectful way, in a way that they feel comfortable, that is important. And it even has halachic ramifications, especially when it comes to rabbinic law. Again, as I said, you have a case, someone stuck in the restroom, they don't have toilet paper, they're going to be embarrassed to go out without cleaning themselves. Right? So we come up with ways you can tear the toilet paper with your elbow, whatever, not on the lines. But because the Torah, right, doesn't want you to just say, well, God said it, so who cares if I'm going to be embarrassed? Who cares? Right? I'll just tell them, well, God told me that I can't rip the toilet paper and forget forget how I feel, forget it. We don't say that. We say that God created us b'tzelem Elokim. God created us in his image. God gives us dignity. And that's part of halacha. And that's important. And as Rav Lichtenstein notes, even if it's hard to define when we express it, it has to be there in the back of our minds. Because the Gemara didn't just say, well, human dignity can be invoked in like technical cases where there's a rabbinic law in play. It comes up with this rhetoric that exudes power. It exudes a conviction. Gadol kavod habriot shedoche lo taseh shebatorah. Human dignity is a great value. It can, in theory, even override a negative law. And therefore, even if we quibble about when we apply it, right, we can't forget that the ability of a human being to perform mitzvot and live their lives with dignity and respect and comfort is a value that the Torah celebrates. And it has to be part of our calculus when we determine what the halacha is. So here we have a tension. On the one extreme, we know that, it can't be that mere discomfort gets you out of all mitzvot. And, a mere indignity gets you out of all mitzvot. It's just not true. I mean, today, I went with a few students. There was a farmer who plants very specific hadassim, Rashi hadassim, with 9 leaves on every row. He's an elderly man at this point in his 70s, and a bunch of his workers were supposed to come to, and they canceled, and he needs to get these out. So he called up the yeshiva, and he said, do you have some volunteers? We need to do a mitzvah. So we took a van, we went, right? And it was 100 degrees outside. I don't know. It felt very hot. And we're out there in the fields, right? I don't think anyone looks at me and says, well, it was uncomfortable. Why did you do that? I think we all understand. It's an elderly man trying to do a mitzvah, trying to make his parnasa, getting ready for Sukkot. His workers canceled on him. That's a great thing, right? And yeah, I went and like the guy said, oh, who are you? And they introduced me. Rabbi Ziring is one of the Rosh Yeshiva. And he's like, oh, one of the Rosh Yeshiva came and he's sweating out there, right? We didn't plan in advance. So I didn't have like the right work clothes. So I just was in my undershirt out there working in 100 degrees with my students. But no one looks at it and says, oh, it was uncomfortable. It wasn't the most dignified. You weren't dressed the way you normally dress, right? Why would you do that? We understand it was important to help this guy do a mitzvah, prepare Sukkot. We all felt good about it. He was happy. We recognize that mere discomfort, a little bit of indignity, you do it because there are important things in life. On the other hand, we recognize that God wants us to have dignity. He doesn't want it to be that every mitzvah, leaves us feeling like, why am I doing this? I feel like I feel like dirt. I feel like an animal, right? He doesn't want us to feel like that. Torah is supposed to edify and inspire. It's not just an act of submission. But how do we balance those values? How do we recognize that on the one hand, there's a limit? On the other hand, right, there's a limit to what can be expected of us. On the other hand, we have to expect something. So here's where I suggest that by the Or Zarua, bringing into conversation these two values, Sukkah, where mere discomfort gets you out of the mitzvah, and then this general value of Gadol Kavod Abriot, what he's hinting at is exactly this compromise. That what we do is as follows. Once a year on Sukkot, when we're living in the Sukkah, we imagine a world where the only value that exists is something like Gadol Kavod Abriot. The idea that mitzvot should only make us feel good and happy and edified and inspired. And therefore, to remind ourselves that mitzvah are fundamentally something that gives us dignity and gives us joy, we program in a rule. The slightest bit of discomfort, it's too hot for you, leave. Too cold, leave. Bugs, leave. It smells, leave. Only live in the sukkah. The sukkah, the mitzvah of sukkah, is living in your home, living in the sukkah the way you would live at home. Do nothing different. Live your normal, dignified life, and that's a mitzvah. And if it's even the slightest bit uncomfortable, you leave. So once a year, we have one mitzvah that reminds us that at their core, mitzvot are supposed to be comfortable and dignified. And how do we express that? How do we remind ourselves of that? By saying that even the slightest bit of discomfort, you're fine. You don't have to do it anymore. But you can't live the entire year like that. You can't say that every mitzvah, you don't have to do something that's slightly uncomfortable, slightly less dignified than you're used to, because then we would never do anything meaningful. So the rest of the year, the bar is set higher. How much higher? It's hard to figure out exactly how high that bar is, right? But it exists, right? The fact that there are going to be limits, that the importance of comfort and dignity is integrated to other mitzvot, that exists. We call it Gadol Kavod Abriot. Shedocha lo taseh shebatorah. That dignity is part of the halachic system. As Rav Chansi notes, it's central to Torah. The exact manifestation, I admit, is hard. But again, like we saw last week, the way that we try to balance it is that once a year we have a mitzvah that we almost bend over backwards to make it the easiest, happiest, most comfortable, most dignified mitzvah. Only do it if you're comfortable. You're not comfortable, you're done, you're fine, right? Don't bother doing it. Do it only when you're happy as happy could be, comfortable as comfortable could be, as dignified as you want to be. And that reminds us of that joy, that dignity, the fact that mitzvot are good for us, right? They're not oppressive. And that comes with us the whole year. The rest of the year, the bar is higher, right? The bar is higher, but it exists in some form, that value that God wants the mitzvah to be comfortable, to provide us with dignified, to edify us and not to oppress us. That's always true. Now, it may be that we have to push ourselves harder for other mitzvot. that we have to suffer certain minor indignities to do things that are important. That's part of life. But to remind ourselves in the back of our mind, so on Sukkot, which is the Chag of Simcha, of joy, right? We say, no. We need once a year for you to remember that mitzvot are about joy, or about dignity, or good for you, right? So that even when you're doing a mitzvah that's a little bit hard and a little bit less dignified than you're happy with, right? You won't come away with a misunderstanding that mitzvot are meant to be oppressive, right? You'll remember Sukkot in the back of your mind and say, mitzvot are good for me. Mitzvot are about dignity. It's true, sometimes I have to push myself in ways that are comfortable. But, right, that's because anything that's worth doing is worth putting in effort. But Sukkot will remind us, right, that sort of pure case will remind us, but you matter, right? And mitzvot are not there to hurt you, right? They're there to make your life meaningful. And yeah, sometimes doing things that are meaningful is not easy. But don't forget that they are meaningful, and that's why God gave them to you. And Sukkot, in its purest form, reminds us of that by telling us that only do it if you're happy. So you have one mitzvah which is pure, right? That it's pure, unmitigated joy. If anything makes you unhappy, you don't have to do it, to remind you what a mitzvah could be and should be, right? At least at some level, even if, because things that are worth doing even when they're hard. Life sometimes complicates that pure form. So again, like we saw by Etrog, I would argue the same thing is true with Sukkah. That once a year we remind ourselves of how joyous mitzvot can be and how much they're supposed to be natural and normal, even if we recognize that, yes, sometimes it's a little bit harder than that and a little bit more complicated, but to have that in the back of our mind. I'll just throw out, we don't have time to get into in detail, but this isn't just a philosophical debate, but halachically, where you draw the line and what we learn from Sukkah is very important in many areas of halacha, especially in cases where people need to perform mitzvah that can make them mildly ill, but not super ill. And that's where the question of where we draw that line between, on the one hand, recognizing you have to do mitzvot even when they're hard, but on the other hand, recognizing that God wants the mitzvot to be good for you. Drawing that line is hard, but it's this analysis, right? Recognizing that two poles and trying to find the middle path that animates the discussion, the discussion that always comes back because 4 of my kids are celiac. And this is, in fact, one of the cases when modern posts can really discuss it is, right, how sick is sick to get you out of eating matzah, right? Because, most celiacs don't get super sick, right? Some do, but most don't get super sick on one little bit. And the post can try to figure out, well, how sick is sick, right? But again, it's this discussion to recognize on the one hand, right, mitzvot are worth doing even when they're hard. On the other hand, but God wants the mitzvot to be good for you and comfortable for you. And using Sukkah as the paradigm, but recognizing that not all the year can be Sukkot. It can remind us that mitzvot are supposed to be happy and dignified and comfortable, but we need to be able to push ourselves sometimes even into zones that are less comfortable. Those two values always animate us, even if drawing the line practically is admittedly very important, but also very difficult. But being able to live with that pole and have Sukkah in the back of our mind reminding us that even if we decide, in this case, you should do the mitzvah when it's less than perfectly comfortable, that's not because God doesn't care about you. It's because God realized that doing things meaningful is sometimes hard, right? Sukkot acts as that model to remind us, but it's still good, right? Mitzvot are still meant to be good and dignified and comfortable and an integrated part of your life. So that is Sukkot, and we'll see one more aspect of this next week, more from an agadic passage. But here I will stop. I'll take questions, and yeah, exactly on time. I finished exactly on time there. Okay, good.
Debbie, do you have any questions? Oh no. Okay.
No, thank you. It was great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Ziring, and thank you so much to everyone who participated today. Thanks for being part of our learning community. We have a full day again today here at Risha. If you have the time still, we would love for you to join us for Rabbi Wendy Salem's class on the Torah readings of Rosh Hashanah tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern, or for Rabbi Alex Ozar's class on Rav Hatner at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And we have other classes scheduled as well. You can learn more about them and register for classes at 5783.drisha.org/Elul. Thank you again, Rabbi Ziring. We'll see you next week, and lehitraot. Shana tova.
Shana tova.